Perfect. Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope we're all okay on this nice sunny Tuesday, and that the kind of previous talks that you've managed to get to have been useful and informative. My name's Will. I've worked on the cyber incident response and investigations team at the ICO for about 4 years now. And today I'm going to be going through a topic on supply chain security. The reason for this kind of presentation today is that we've seen quite a large uptick over the last 12 months to 18 months of incidents that have impacted both data processors and supply chain providers, which have led to quite large impacts on a large number of data controllers. It's not unusual for us to see single instance impact data controllers into the hundreds over the last few months. So we just wanted to kind of do a talk around the kind of things we expect data controllers to see when looking at their kind of data processors and working with processors, as well as the non-processors within their supply chain. So that's really the format that this presentation is going to take. Start off with, I'm going to look at data processors. Nice easy place to start, as the legislation is quite clear in terms of what's kind of required for working with data processors. We'll then move on to non-processor elements of the supply chain and go through a few examples with managed service providers, third-party software, and code packages. And then I'll be looking a little bit at responsibility in terms of notifying data subjects and notifying the ICO, as well as who is responsible for what in terms of kind of incident response and things like that. We're going to be doing some questions at the end, just for time constraint purposes. I'm going to keep the questions at the end rather than as I go through. So please feel free to submit those questions, and then my colleague John will be putting those questions to me at the end for however many we have time for. So start with, move over to the first thing. So to start with, I'm going to look at data processors and what we kind of expect to see between data controllers and data processors. Now, data processors are kind of bound by elements of the UK GDPR and the DPA, specifically in terms of their security and their organisational measures. But just because data processors are required to have the technical and organisational measures in place, it doesn't mean that controllers can kind of assume that the processes they use are going to be secure or are going to follow those practices. There's still considerations that we expect controllers to make before commissioning a data processor or commissioning somebody within their supply chain in general, really. So as you can see, there's a quote there from the legislation which says that controllers shall only use processors providing sufficient guarantees to implement appropriate technical and organisational measures. Effectively, what that means is that before you commission a data processor, before you hand any data over to a third-party processor, you need to get some assurances that they are going to protect the data sufficiently and proportionately with the risk of the information that they're being provided with. It does give a few specific considerations that need to be made, which are kind of the bare minimum of consideration that you should be making. The first of which is looking at the pseudonymization and encryption of personal information. And that kind of pseudonymization and encryption isn't necessarily you have to have all of your information encrypted or pseudonymized. It's just an element to consider, which is is this proportionate to the information that we're going to be given to the processors? And it's something that you at least need to consider, especially if you're deciding not to implement those security measures, and kind of documenting why that is or isn't appropriate. The ability to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resilience of systems. Now, those are obviously all very important aspects of a personal data breach, and there is often I suppose more emphasis put on confidentiality, and we see organisations look at personal data breaches or impacts at data processors and just kind of say, well, there's not been any data exfiltrated, therefore it's not a personal data breach, which is not the case, and there could be kind of any combination of those three or any single part of those three, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, that could all by themselves or in combination lead to personal data breaches, which is particularly relevant with ransomware at the moment, where just because if your systems have been encrypted or if the processor systems have been encrypted, even without exfiltration, there is still a chance that a reportable incident has occurred. And you need to be getting assurances that the processor you're using is going to be able to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, and availability of systems and data as far as you can ensure those things. The ability to restore is also very important, and that doesn't just mean that you're making sure your processor has backup systems in place. What you also need to be making sure is that those backup systems or equivalent have sufficient response to incidents. So make sure the backup systems are offline or at least segregated from the main network, we see quite a lot of instances where the organisation had backups in place, but they couldn't recover the data because the backups were impacted by the incident because they weren't appropriately following best practice by segregating or putting them offline. So that's an element that you need to get assurances of as well before commissioning a processor. And finally, the process for regularly testing and assessing the evaluation of the measures that we've kind of just talked about. When you commission a data processor, it isn't just necessarily about the moment that you commission that data processor. We do tend to look for kind of ongoing assurances, seeing what the controller is doing, talking to the processor to get repeat assurances that the standards that they require are being met. And not just kind of handing the data over, signing the contracts, and then kind of forgetting about it and assuming that they're going to be secure. What all of this really boils down to is you as a controller setting up and saying, okay, if we were going to do this processing ourselves, if this was going to be on our systems, what level of security would we require? What would we be looking for in terms of the kind of security, the encryption, or the protections of this data, and then making sure any processor you use at least meets the requirements of the security you'd have put in place yourself, or that you would expect to be in place yourself. So in terms of how you actually get these assurances, the GDPR, the UK GDPR, puts quite a lot of emphasis on contracts. Obviously, contracts are really only useful at the point of kind of commissioning the data processor. And as I say, there's still a requirement for an ongoing assurance process there between the two parties. But contracts are kind of the first hurdle that you need to get over. And if there isn't a compliant contract in place, it's very unlikely that the processing itself is going to be compliant. So what you need to have in these agreements between controllers and processors is an indication that the processor will only process on specific instruction from you as a controller. You don't want a processor to be making decisions on what to do with the data. You want to be the people making the decision, or you want to be the organisation making the decision. And the processor should just facilitate that action, not make any decisions on your behalf. The processor should take all measures pursuant to Article 32. So Article 32 is the requirement to have appropriate technical and organisational measures in place to protect personal data. Again, the processors have a requirement in the legislation to be to follow Article 32, but you as a controller, for your own ability to show compliance, needs to have in the contract a guarantee that those will be followed. That the processor will not engage another processor without written authorization. And that goes a little bit further as well to say that if that processor is going to use another processor and you authorize them to do so, that second processor or that sub-processor also needs to have the same security measures that you have required from the original processor. There's no real point in getting a processor with strong security measures to sign an agreement that says they're going to process personal data in a compliant way if they're going to handle that data over to somebody else that you don't have the same assurances for. So you need to think about all the parties that are going to be processing your data and not just the company that you're handing it over to. One that's missed quite a lot is about the assisting the data controller in exercising the rights of data subjects. Anything from kind of subject access requests to right to rectification or erasure. If you've got a processor that doesn't necessarily know what information they're hosting or they're processing on your behalf, it may be that you as a controller need to handle all of those requests, but we do see situations where the controller and processor does need to work together to actually provide responses and to action those requests. And it's important that you have assurances as a controller that the processor will do everything they can to aid in that, as it is you as a controller's responsibility to actually make sure those requests get dealt with within the required time frame. And finally, make all information available to you that you need to demonstrate compliance with the relevant articles. So this doesn't necessarily just mean I suppose they're providing you with the assurances and the contracts at the start. This could be you ask them to provide you with the outputs of their testing or their security scans or their security audits on a regular basis, so you can get ongoing assurances that your processor is securing personal data appropriately, and you can then provide that evidence to us to say, look, we have actually done our bit in ensuring that this third party has got appropriate security in place. We'll touch a little bit more on this later on, but the RCO can and will investigate both parties in an incident where processors and controllers are impacted. We'll look at them through two slightly different lenses, but as I say, we'll get to that a little bit later on. So as I say, really, in terms of working with processors, the legislation is relatively clear in terms of what is expected. It's about kind of getting initial and ongoing assurances that the processor is going to handle personal data securely and that you can demonstrate your compliance by showing the assurances that you've got from the processor that they're doing so. Where the legislation becomes slightly less clear is with supply chain and non-processor onto the supply chain specifically, because as soon as you start deviating into non-processor supply chains, so managed service providers, IT providers, any organisation that has access to your network or systems, suddenly the responsibility comes down on you as a data controller. There's none of the kind of split responsibility you see between controllers and processors. It's down to your organization to make sure that any impact or any incident in your supply chain doesn't lead to a personal data breach within your organization. Now, how you go about doing that is a very, I suppose, bespoke process from an organisational perspective. But what we've got here are some indicators of good practice, really, in terms of what we kind of look for when we're conducting these investigations. The first one, which is, I suppose, quite obvious, is just treating all supply chain providers as though they're data processors. You'll always be on a good footing with your supply chain if you get the same assurances from your supply chain providers as you would do from data processors. So assurances that they have appropriate security in place, that they're going to let you know if an incident occurs that could impact your organization, and that they're going to continue to uphold their kind of security standards throughout the process of your relationship with them. So if you just kind of treat your supply chain as all processors, you'll always be on kind of a good footing to be able to show your compliance to the ICO in the event that an investigation was to take place. Understanding the systems, services and data that supply chain providers have access to is another big one. We see a number of incidents revolving around supply chain attacks where the organisation has to retrospectively go back and determine what did that supply chain provider have access to within our systems, what data could they access, and obviously what personal data could they access. You don't want to be doing that as part of your incident response. We like to see kind of a documented understanding of what that supply chain provider has access to, what any accounts that they use within your network can access. So if an incident does occur, you have a good understanding straight away of what potentially could have been impacted. There is recital 87 in the UK GDPR, which sets quite a high bar for this, because it does say that organisations should be able to immediately ascertain if a personal data breach has taken place, and to then be able to notify data subjects, obviously without undue delay. And hitting that bar of immediately being able to determine if a personal data breach has taken place is very difficult unless you have a working understanding of what your supply chain can access before an incident takes place. The next one is documenting the risks posed by your supply chain and review and mitigate these as appropriate. We do accept kind of risk-based approaches. We don't expect every single member of your supply chain, especially if you've got many organisations working with you, to all have exactly the same level of security. It's all about proportionality and making sure you understand the risk posed by each element of your supply chain and you can apply the security controls and the assurances appropriately across those areas. And as I say, as long as you can document a decision and a risk-based decision, we're more than happy for organisations to take a risk-based approach in this situation. The next one is one that you'll see across pretty much all the slides from here on out, which is our process for monitoring and reviewing your systems, services and data. Quite often organisations will put too much of an emphasis on perimeter security and stopping attackers from getting in. What we prefer to see is defence in depth and principle of least privilege, to kind of assume that at some point an attacker is going to successfully get into your network or your systems, and make sure you have a methodology to detect and mitigate that access. We don't want to see situations where if an attacker gets into the network, that automatically is going to lead to a personal data breach, because once they're in, they can have free reign amongst your systems and data. It's absolutely vital, not just for general GDPR compliance, but specifically when working with supply chain providers, that you have a second line of defence within your network to monitor and determine when an attack has taken place. The principle of least privilege is again one that we like to see quite a lot, and it goes back to understanding the system, services and data that supply chain providers have access to, because if you understand the systems they have access to and you can limit that to only what they need to have access to, then you're in a good position not only to respond to an incident, but actually prevent an incident from occurring, as any attacker that gets in through those means shouldn't be able to then have free reign across your network, because they're limited to only what the supply chain provider was able to access in the first place. Going on to a few kind of specific examples of this now, we've got managed service providers in the supply chain. Now, these, I suppose, could be anybody really in terms of managed service providers, but generally what we see when an incident occurs is a managed service providers such as IT providers that are external or similar organisations to that who have a kind of remote accessibility into your organisation's network. These often pose a really high risk to the organisation because you have limited control over how the accounts themselves are being secured or how the kind of managed service provider is doing their security, but there is a massive risk to your organisation should those accounts be compromised. So what we are looking for in these points, again, these are kind of indicators of good practice, and it's all about proportionality. But what we like to see is, are any of the remote access solutions being used by those managed service providers configured to kind of best practice? So you've got multi-factor authentication for sure on all of your remote access solutions, and potentially even IP controls, so you can strongly authenticate any users into your network with confidence that you know who they are and where they're originating from. Monitoring, this is a point that will hammer home a lot, as again that second line of defense is vital. Ultimately, you need to be assuming that at some point something is going to go wrong in your supply chain, and you need to be able to protect your internal systems when that happens. And the easiest way of doing that is to monitor your systems and make sure you have a process of repeatedly looking at logs, monitoring your systems, and at the very least kind of privileged accounts and any accounts that are used or controlled externally, as they pose the highest risk. Developing and documenting a process for responding to incidents at managed service providers. Again, if you're treating all your managed service providers as out-and-out data processors, hopefully you've got provisions in there that managed service provider will have to tell you if an incident occurs. And as part of your incident response plan, which you should have documented internally, you'll have provisions in there for how to respond should your managed service provider say we've had a compromise, and a way of then you going and seeing if your systems have been impacted by that, or if an attacker has moved laterally into your systems from the service provider that's been compromised. And finally, understanding and documenting the systems that are at risk should an MSP be compromised. Like on the last slide, you don't want to be retrospectively trying to figure this out during your incident response. It's taken some organisations weeks, if not months, to go back and figure out what data could have been accessed and could have been exfiltrated. You're in a much better stead to notify data subjects without undue delay and notify the ICO within 72 hours of the incident if you already know the systems and data that are at risk following a compromise within your supply chain, and make sure that it's documented internally and it's not something you have to go into as part of your incident response to say, okay, well, what could they have accessed and what could they have access to, and how does that impact on personal data? Moving on to the second example, which is third-party software. This is obviously something that pretty much all organisations utilise, and often utilise on quite a large scale. And if vulnerabilities appear in third-party software, attackers are on it very, very quickly. As soon as a new update is released, attackers will very often go and have a look at the release logs and see, okay, well, what vulnerabilities have been fixed, and therefore we'll go and find people that haven't updated this software, and we know what vulnerabilities to see in this software and how we can exploit it. So our indicators of good practice, really, when working with third-party software, is documenting and then following and enforcing, which is something that some organisations fall down on, a patching policy or an update policy that keeps their software up to date and minimises the existence of known vulnerabilities on the network. This is key. It's a kind of a foundational element of the security, is just anything that you have installed on your network, make sure that it's being kept up to date, and any vulnerabilities are risk assessed and patched as soon as possible. And if they can't be done as soon as possible, then at least as soon as available, or as soon as your organisation is able to, within the bounds of the risk that's being posed by it. The principle of least privilege again applies here. You want to be limiting the exposure to personal data. It shouldn't necessarily be that a single vulnerability within a third-party piece of software enables an attacker access to all of your organization's systems or your personal data that you're processing. You want to make sure that there is a second line of defense there, that actually, even if that vulnerability, if it's a zero-day vulnerability or a vulnerability that enables the attacker into your network, you can still protect the personal data, and they don't just get free rein to go and traverse over and exfiltrate whatever they like. Have a process for selecting and limiting the software that can be used on your network. This is key because it has I suppose, a two birds, one stone approach. First one is that you can't update software that you don't know is on your network. So if you're enabling employees or any staff members or contractors to download and install whatever software they like on their devices or on your servers or anywhere across your network estate, that software can quite easily become outdated because the organization as a whole isn't aware that there's updates that needed to be applied there. So you should determine what software is needed for you to conduct your business activities and then effectively prevent anything else from being installed without authorization. What this also helps do is prevent attackers from bringing malicious tooling within the environment. Some of the initial reconnaissance steps that we see from attackers is often installing Mimikatz or other credential stealing tools. And if you have a strongly locked down environment that doesn't allow malicious or even unauthorized software to be brought into the network, then you're a good way to preventing those malicious toolings from being executed and hopefully stopping the kind of attacker from doing reconnaissance that could lead to a personal data breach. Ensure that third-party software is within scope of your kind of testing and your security audits. You don't want to assume that just because it's developed externally, it's going to be secure. That's almost never the case. So you just need to make sure that any software you are using isn't creating holes or vulnerabilities in your systems. And remember that you're, I suppose, responsible for that and responsible for protecting your network and the personal data within it, even though the software itself may have been developed by a third party. Now, we do recognise that often there are situations where an update is available, but it cannot be applied due to a business need. So, for example, if there is a version that's conflicting with another piece of software, and they'll break and your business won't be able to operate on either if you update, or if there is a key feature or function of the software that's being decommissioned in a new version that your business relies on. We recognise that there are situations where it isn't always tenable to perform those updates immediately. So instead, what we would look for is a pretty thorough and documented risk assessment that your organisation can sit down and say, we weren't able to apply this patch or this update for these reasons, but this is what we did to help mitigate that risk. And that could be anything from putting additional monitoring in place where that software is, moving it to a different part of the network, or just at least some kind of recognition that there is now an increased risk because you haven't been able to I suppose you haven't been able to update it within the normal time frame that we would expect. And finally, the kind of final example for the supply chain that we're going to be looking at is code and code dependencies. So if your organization is building software for themselves, there will be very often a high number, probably in the hundreds at the very least, of software dependencies or software packages that will be used to kind of speed up the development or brought in to aid prevent you from having to build all software from scratch. I'm sure that we've seen the Log4j incident that happened a number of months ago that suddenly impacted a lot of organizations, and that comes about from organizations using external code within their own software development that can then lead to problems if the original package or the original library ends up having a vulnerability in it. A lot of this is very similar to the previous slide, but with a couple of kind of additions. So the first one, the same really, regularly performing automated scans of software dependencies, detecting any new versions and updating them as soon as possible where that's available to your organization, and where the update isn't available, making sure that you risk assess and take into account what other mitigations you might be able to apply. Understanding the risks and then documenting those of the different types of software that you're using. So we're using a lot of open source software, you're using closed source software. They all carry different risk profiles with them, and your organization needs to plan accordingly, depending on the kind of software that you're using in the development activities. Monitoring, again, can't stress the point enough that it's an area that organizations fall down on quite often when we go in and conduct our investigations. That second line of defense, that ability to detect incidents and respond to them as soon as possible, is absolutely vital in terms of showing us compliance with the UK GDPR, and specifically the ability to protect personal data on a technical level. And ultimately, at this point, it is your responsibility as a data controller, to protect the personal data in your systems. Even, as I say, if this vulnerability does come about from a third-party library, we do still need to look at your organisation, how you were mitigating it, how you were protecting the personal data that you were responsible for. Integrity monitoring is one that I've added in here because we see a lot of payment diversion attacks where a malicious party will go into the code of a website and input a malicious script that takes credit card information as people go through a checkout process. Integrity monitoring is something we always recommend. So if you have a code base that is processing personal data or collecting personal data in any way, make sure you understand what changes are being made to that code, especially if some of those changes may be coming externally, and ensure that any changes that are being made you know about, have been authorized, and aren't adding anything malicious into the code base that could then impact on personal data that's entered into an application or a website or anything like that. And finally, secure your development environment. So especially if you're using GitHub or one of the other alternatives, protect those accounts as you would any other. Put multi-factor authentication on them. Make sure that you are strongly controlling the username and passwords with a strong password policy, and making sure that you know who can access your code environment and your code base, and that a malicious party isn't going to be able to get in there, along with all of the other, I suppose, best practices, such as not storing any passwords or API keys in plain text within your code. You need to ensure that that environment is as secure as possible, because it can be a big weak point and a big risk area for a lot of organizations. So looking at kind of the relationship between controllers and both processes and members of their supply chain. During an incident, or if an incident is to occur, it's very likely that all the parties will need to work together. Hopefully your organization has in their contracts and in their agreements with your data processors, with your supply chain members, an agreement that they will notify you if an incident occurs. You don't want to be in the dark on that. So you don't want to be finding out when it hits the media or when the data is published online. You need to be able to respond immediately. Make sure you have assurances of this, as we touched on to start with. Your contract should cover it, and you should have an ongoing relationship with the processor or service provider, whoever it may be, that their security is still meeting the correct standards. But if an incident does occur, you will then need to work together with that party to gather the incident details. You should already have a good understanding of what data is at risk. As we've previously touched on, and looking at recital 87, you should understand what data is at risk, what data you gave to that processor, what data that service provider had access to, and be able to kind of form a likelihood of what the risk to data subjects is very early on. As I've said previously, we see plenty of cases where it takes organizations weeks, if not months, to actually determine what data has been impacted in this sort of incident. And really, it's often, we respect that there is challenges, especially with ransomware, to actually decrypting and finding what data was accessed. But more often than not, it comes down to the organization not knowing in the first place where their data was, and who they were giving it to. And actually, there's a more structural issue there than there just having been a ransomware attack. So you need to make sure that you have that good understanding and that is documented. Have a documented incident response plan. It seems obvious, but it can help organizations deal with these incidents, especially if there is a playbook there for dealing with the third parties, what information you need to be gathering from your processors or from your supply chain members, and how actually to go about mitigating these incidents, or even determining if there has been an incident. You may get a notification from somebody in your supply chain saying that they've been compromised, and you then need to go away and know how to do your checks to see if the attacker moved into your network, and that should be documented within the incident response plan. And then you need to determine how that personal data has been impacted as early as possible. So you should already know what data there is there to be impacted, but you need to look at, is it confidentiality, availability, or integrity? Again, remembering that it isn't just confidentiality that leads to a personal data breach. It can be right across the board. 1, 2, or even 3 of those different elements can all constitute a personal data breach. And the lack of exfiltration, again, does not mean that there hasn't been a personal data breach that needs to be reported to either ourselves or the impacted individuals. Next is the reporting and the investigation. So the onus always lies with the controller to report to the ICO. There isn't the 72-hour requirement for processors. However, we do welcome any reports from the processors to kind of get out ahead, because we will reach out to them, we will ask them questions, and we will investigate their Article 32 compliance. So if data processors do want to submit information so we can receive information quicker and make appropriate decisions earlier on, that's always appreciated. But in the end, it's the controller that has the responsibility to report an incident to the ICO, and also to impacted data subjects, which is another reason why for controllers it is absolutely imperative that you have assurances in place that you will be told when an incident takes place. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen where processors will try and not share that information with controllers, or will kind of deem that it isn't important enough for the controller to know about. And in reality, it is, and you need to be able to make your own decisions on whether your threshold for reporting has been met, because the obligation is on yourselves as controllers. In terms of how an ICO investigation looks into these kind of incidents, so to start with if it's a supply chain, so non-processor supply chain providers, we'll look at the controller. If it's kind of a zero-day vulnerability that they couldn't reasonably have had any knowledge of, then we'll probably focus more on the secondary security, so the monitoring, the kind of second line of defense that I've been talking about, the defense in depth, and the principle of least privilege. That the organization had to prevent that attack from having a heavily detrimental impact on their organization, and we'll conduct the investigation entirely into the controller, with occasional, I suppose, considerations for if it was obviously a zero-day attack, that there's limited that they could have done to protect themselves against that in the first instance, but there's often a lot they can do to actually mitigate it. When it comes to controllers and processors, we will often investigate both sides. So we will usually split the investigation off. We will send one set of inquiries out to the impacted controllers, ask for copies of contracts that were in place to make sure that they're compliant with the legislation, and check to make sure that they were getting the assurances that we talked about earlier on in the presentation. Usually, if a controller can present those assurances to us and show us that they did have a reasonable belief that the processor was securing personal data proportionately to the risk, and they had a good relationship with them in a way that enabled them to keep on top of security changes, then that's good. That's what we like to see. And then we will go to the data processor and evaluate their Article 32 compliance, and that will tend to be where the technical inquiries come in, and we look at how the actual attack occurred. How the attack occurred and what could have been done to prevent it. Okay. No, I think that is the last slide of this presentation, which means I will have a bit of time for questions now at the end. I think that my colleague John has been keeping an eye on questions that have been coming in. So if you could read them out to me, that would be great.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, looks like we've got about 9 minutes, maybe slightly less, for some questions. We've had a steady stream of them coming in, which is good. So thanks to everyone posting those into the chat. So the first question we'll go to is in regard to the checking the security of data processors. If they have accreditation such as ISO 27001, can we be sure that they meet all the requirements, or do we need to carry out our own checks to prove that we are assured?
I think that the level that you go to beyond accreditation often depends on the risk of the processing in the first instance. If you're dealing with kind of special category data, so health data, biometrics, criminal conviction data, you may want to go to, I suppose, higher lengths to ensure and do your own checks to ensure that they have the measures you would expect in place. However, accreditation can often be a good indication that an organization's taking their security seriously. So for I suppose lower risk processing, if it's basic identifiers or kind of contact details, you may as an organization determine that seeing the accreditation is sufficient to you, is a sufficient assurance. Ultimately, it comes down to your risk tolerance within the organization. What's most important is that you kind of document that decision, and you document how you're getting those assurances and how you saw those assurances as being appropriate for the data that you were giving them. I think I would struggle to say specifically this is exactly what every organization needs to be looking for. They need to be looking for this accreditation, or this accreditation isn't good enough, because it is a very bespoke approach that's ultimately down to data controllers to determine in terms of how much risk they're willing to tolerate and how much they need to get their own assurances and do their own checks. But as long as that's kind of documented and part of a risk-based approach, I think quite often kind of that assurances of accreditation can be at the very least a great first step in kind of getting the assurances that you need from the processes.
Thanks. So the second question is, encryption in some cases could be defeated. Does the ICO encourage data minimization, which would potentially save many organizations from data breaches, or at least the extent of a breach?
I mean, absolutely, yes, in terms of encouraging data minimization. You should only really be processing what you need in the first instance, and that kind of encroaches on your kind of retention policies and things like that. But on the whole, we agree that encryption in certain standards can be defeated. There is ways that you can mitigate that, especially if you've got kind of a key pair or a decryption key that you are hosting, and making sure that that is secure and kept separately from the data itself. But in reality, it's kind of not a one or the other situation. There should be data minimization and restricted processing going on in place where you're not processing more than you need to, or not holding more information than you need to in the first instance. But there is still a chance that even if you are minimizing what you're processing, what you are processing needs to be kind of encrypted or pseudonymized, or having an equivalent security measure attached to it. Again, the GDPR does mention encryption quite a lot. I do think that, again, it's very much a risk-based approach. For some data, it's much, I suppose it's almost a requirement, especially if you're looking at special category data and putting good protections in place there. But it isn't by any means something that needs to be applied everywhere if it isn't proportionate, as long as there is proportionate or alternatives in place for you to not only protect the personal data, but also minimize the impact to data subjects if an incident does take place.
We've got about 5 minutes left, try and get through a couple more questions. With the rise and reliance on software as a service, there is less control of the security of the wider network, i.e. we are less reliant on on-prem kit and servers, and data is stored outside of the traditional organizational network. Do you have any observations on controls that could be considered in a software as a service environment or service to protect the data stored or processed inside of it?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely an interesting one as more and more organizations move to these software as a service providers. One thing that we often request in these situations is the shared responsibility models that are in place with the service provider. So making sure that at the very least your organization has an understanding of what it is you're responsible for and what it is that the service provider is responsible for. So if you're using, say, AWS or Google Cloud or one of those kind of providers, making sure you understand that while they may be responsible for the physical security of the environment, and maybe even some other layers depending on the service that you're using, there is going to be elements that you're responsible for in that environment. And whilst I understand and we recognise that there's limited that you could do,
I think you've just come back, Will.
I might come back. Sorry, yeah. I think my device may be overheating because I'm on my screen's just gone dark. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. All right, I'll carry on then. I can't see you guys, but do feel free to carry on.
All right, no worries. Yeah, it's that heat. So we'll go on to, we've probably got time for another couple of questions. So the next one is, we are a public sector organisation with multiple data processors for different aspects of our services. Given that we have limited resources, what does proportionate and realistic testing look like?
I mean, I think that the proportionality is all about the data that you as an organisation are processing, and you may have, and I would expect that organisations would have multiple different supply chain providers. But again, it's about risk-based approaches. We don't necessarily expect the same measures to be in place across the entire supply chain or across all of your data processes. It's just about recognizing which the most high-risk ones are, and then deviating your resources or your time to the more high-risk areas, and maybe accepting that there is you can tolerate more risk in some other areas or some other providers because they are processing lower risk information on your behalf. But the proportionality ultimately comes down to the personal data that's being processed in the first instance.
Time for just one last one. I think it's one that's just come in recently, and that is, what is the difference between data processors and managed service providers?
So in the context of this presentation, data processors are the organizations that you give the personal data to in order for them to process. So they're processing personal data on your behalf. They could be I suppose hosting providers or software as a service providers, or any organization whose systems hold personal data for whom you are the controller. When I talk about managed service providers, I'm talking more about organizations that come into your network. So for example, if you have an IT support team that is external or that's run externally, they will have access to your IT infrastructure. They don't actually process any personal data, but they could in theory access it through their access to your account or to your network. So data process is more about data leaving your systems and going elsewhere, and managed service providers are more about other individuals or other organizations coming into your network that could, I suppose, pose a risk if they were to be compromised and provide an attacker access into your network.
I think that might have been the last one. I think we've probably run out of time.
Perfect. Well, in that case, thank you very much, everybody, for coming to the presentation today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and don't get too warm in the heat as my laptop seems to have done. But yeah, thank you very much.